Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Olga Hakova. I'm a Deputy Director for European Energy Security at the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Really wonderful to see you all here today, and welcome to our virtual audience. Thank you for joining the Global Energy Center's Transatlantic Climate and Energy Security Program, as well as the Europe Center today, our partner on this event, for this very timely conversation on how to end Russia's influence in Europe. And again, thank you all of you who've joined us here in person, and welcome to the virtual audience. It is a privilege to welcome Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt, who is the Assistant Secretary of Energy Resources, but exercising role since January 10th of the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and Environment at the U.S. Department of State. So welcome, it's an honor to have you here.
Thanks, Olga. Great to be here.
In this new Atlantic Council space, and Ambassador Pyatt is one of the longest serving foreign service officials here, so it's a double, triple honor. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we kick off the conversation and this event. I want to make sure that everyone is aware that this conversation is streaming live. We will have an opportunity for a Q&A. We have some mics lined up here for in-person questions. We also have an opportunity for you to ask questions online at askac.org. So again, this conversation is on the record. Assistant Secretary, welcome. Let's just dive right in. I think everyone here is really curious about some of the latest developments in the energy space, in the transatlantic space, and of course, the end of Ukraine transit. Ukraine has a 200 BCM, billion cubic meters network. For context, this is two-thirds of European total gas demand, a massive network. And now there's no Russian molecules of gas flowing through Ukraine to Europe. Help us appreciate this moment.
So I think, Olga, and thank you for having me, and congratulations on the new facility, by the way. But I would start by noting that this conversation started in a discussion that Fred Kemp and I had a couple of months ago in Istanbul. And we were talking about the extraordinary changes that have taken place in the global energy system over the past few years, and just the importance of recognizing the strategic consequences of that development vis-a-vis the end of European dependency on Russian energy, the rise of the United States, and the dramatic growth of America's LNG industry, the growth in our crude oil production, what that means for our strategic interests in the transatlantic context, but also globally. So in many ways, what happened on January 1st, which was a real historic turning point, I think, for Europe and especially for the Ukrainians, was an indicator of how that world has changed and how important that it is that those of us who are engaged in thinking about U.S. national security and our strategic interests incorporate that into our algorithm. So, as you noted, Ukraine for decades had been the major channel of Russian gas transit to Europe. President Zelensky pointed out that 25 years ago, 130 BCM a year were flowing through Ukraine to European markets. Today, that number is 0. There was a very strong statement that the White House spokesperson, John Kirby, offered last week, highlighting the enormous strategic defeat that this represents for Vladimir Putin. The fact that Gazprom is going to lose $6 billion a year of revenue, which goes straight to pay for the drones and missiles that are destroying Ukrainian cities and hospitals and schools. But also the fact that Russia has lost its traditionally most important energy market. And I'm convinced there's no coming back. What was really important, I think, about January 1st, aside from the clear determination among the Ukrainians to put an end to that transit, was the signal for Brussels and the fact that President von der Leyen, the new energy commissioner, Jorgensen, Director General Jorgensen, were all so clear over many, many months that European countries and markets had plenty of time to adapt to a world without Russian energy, and that it was time to get on with it. I think the other aspect of this, which for those like you and me who've been engaged in our support to Ukraine is also critically important, is the implications for Ukraine's domestic politics. And I will say from my tenure as ambassador, there is no issue that has been a greater driver of Russian malign influence in Ukrainian politics and society since independence than energy. You saw it in the corrupt influences that were exercised. I had a front row seat in the fall and winter of 2013 when Putin was trying to prevent President Yanukovych from going ahead with the EU association agreement. Remember, the sword of Damocles that Putin wielded over Bankova was gas, and cheap gas. And so it's really, really important to Ukraine's European trajectory and the determination of the Ukrainians themselves to build a future in Europe that linkage has been severed. And I'm convinced it's never coming back. We can talk a little bit later on about the role in the transatlantic context, but what I would also highlight here as we think about Ukraine is in a post-war scenario, for a Europe that is never going to go back to dependence on Russian energy, Ukraine is positioned to play a critical role as an alternative supplier, as a location for storage, all the work that Naftogaz has already done to leverage its significant gas storage capacity, but also all the new infrastructure that's emerging across Europe. And I really want to emphasize that this has not been driven from Washington. This has been driven by the Europeans themselves. And at last point in this opening, I was delighted to see Dan Fried's tweet the other day, recalling that for many years when he was our Assistant Secretary for Europe and in other senior State Department roles, he would travel around the world and in Europe especially, and get polite smiles when he flagged the risk of dependency on Russian energy. But now it's the Europeans themselves who've made the decision to go in a different direction.
You mentioned how challenging the route has been to get to this point and the level of leadership that it took in Europe, but also from allies like the United States. Could you talk about some of the lessons learned and that could be applied towards the future, some of the best practices in terms of kind of what do you think worked well, what didn't, as we kind of finalize decoupling from Russia, because there's still some reliance across areas like nuclear, critical materials, some gas going through Turkey, LNG. The importance of allies helping Europe, supporting Europe, working closely with Europe in getting to that full decoupling.
Good. So I think the first and most important point is that this needs to remain a bipartisan issue in American politics. And I will share with you, there was a little cheer that went up across the ENR suite this morning when we were all watching Senator Rubio's confirmation hearing. And the first question that came from Chairman Risch was, what do you think about those sanctions on Russian energy? Which then led Senator Rubio to offer a very strong statement about the dangers of European dependence on Russian energy, the importance of sustaining the continued diversification. The policy wonk in me was thrilled to hear Senator Rubio talking about FSRUs and some of the investments that Europe has made, Germany and others, to diversify their energy sources. But what really came through in that exchange is that our next Secretary of State is clearly thinking about energy as a strategic attribute, which of course is the raison d'etre of the Energy Bureau that I lead at the State Department. I think another lesson learned is the importance of very intense bureaucratic engagement. And I think I would argue that amid the tragedy of Ukraine over the past 3 years, one of the real bright spots has been an extraordinary level of transatlantic cooperation. That's happened at the level of the president, at the level of the Secretary of State, all of the work with both the Commission, but also with member states, the work that we've done through the NSC-led LNG task force, the work that my team has led through the US-EU Energy Council, and the work that we've done there. And I'll say one other plug as we think about the new administration. I hope very much that we will all be able to work together to see to it that Secretary of State Rubio is able to participate in sometime early in 2025 in the next round of the US-EU Energy Council, because that's been an extraordinarily valuable platform in order to harmonize our approach to these issues. It's also important, and I will take some credit for this, that we're now bringing the private sector in. And Dita Jorgensen, my counterpart in DG Energy, has been a great supporter of this. And I think at the end of the day, because our energy economy is not driven by the government, it's driven by private companies. So bringing those private companies into the equation is a big part of the story. And then finally, I would highlight global allies. And in the Atlantic Council context, I remember so vividly, I guess it was 2 years ago in New York at the big Atlantic Council gala during UNGA Week. You had President Zelensky and President von der Leyen and Prime Minister Kishida there. And if you will remember, I mean, Prime Minister Kishida spoke with great sincerity about the decision that Japan had made to allow some of its LNG cargoes to be redestined for Europe in the heat of the invasion in 2022, but the extraordinary gratitude from President von der Leyen and the understanding that took a global coalition working together to navigate through these issues. The last point I'll make, I'm in a somewhat unique position because when the invasion of Ukraine began in February of 2022, I was a US ambassador serving in the European Union. So I had a front row seat working with Energy Minister Skrekis, Prime Minister Mitsotakis, but also talking to the Bulgarians, all of Greece's neighbors, to see the real sense of panic that was rippling across European politics and industry in those months. Remember, it was Bulgaria, ironically, that was the first target of Gazprom's cutoff in April, May of 2022. And I remember talking to the Bulgarian Prime Minister. I mean, just real concern about people freezing through the winter. Putin tried to exercise an energy weapon to break European solidarity with Ukraine. He failed. And Europe has now navigated 3 winters of Russia's weaponization of its energy resources. Storage levels are at an all-time high. And I think this was a gun with 1 bullet in it, and Putin fired that bullet, and he's never going to be able to reload. And so it's a little bit like the big bad wolf, huff and puff and blow your house down. But Europe has now built a house of bricks, and so I really see Putin as having suffered an enormous strategic defeat. But it's also, and this came up in the hearing this morning in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it's also a defeat that has enormous implications for our transatlantic alliance and security relationships.
Thank you so much for bringing up Bulgaria, and because I think that case is very relevant today as we watch what's happening to Moldova and parts of Moldova that are illegally occupied by Russia. No one is safe from Russia's blackmail, even Russia's allies, and I think that's a really important lesson to learn here. In terms, and the irony of this situation too is, had Russia not went forward with the atrocities in Ukraine, with the full-scale attack on Ukraine, they were set up to increase their exports to Europe. They were on track to increase both LNG and piped exports. So that's the ironic piece of this conversation.
Well, and the tragedy. I mean, that it took this invasion to induce a strategic shift in Europe's approach. And I was among the American diplomats making the case long before February 2022 to avoid deepening that dependency. And I'm very proud of the work that I did, inheriting the work of several of my predecessors to build out the Southern Gas Corridor, for instance, completing the TAP pipeline through Greece and Albania into Italy. Thank goodness that project was completed when it was in 2020, because it played an absolutely critical role in bringing non-Russian gas from Azerbaijan, in particular, into Italy after the weaponization of Gazprom's resources. The work we did with Greece and Bulgaria to build the IGB pipeline. And then, as Senator Rubio pointed out this morning, the rapid pace with which Both the Europeans were able to invest in additional regasification capacity in Turkey, in Germany, in Lithuania, in Italy, but also the surge in gas volumes that came out of the United States. And I want to make sure later on we talk a little bit about that side of the equation as well, because that's, I think, the other strategic error that Putin made was his failure to recognize how the global market had shifted from underneath him in a sector that is the principal source of the Kremlin's revenue and which is the principal pillar of the power vertical that surrounds the Kremlin.
Speaking of Kremlin's revenues and solidarity on the European and just a broader transatlantic side, multiple levels of sanctions have been introduced.
Last Friday was a big day.
Yeah, and especially, let's talk about some of the latest sanctions by US. UK has joined on some of those as well, impacting close to 800,000 barrels of oil per day, LNG projects being sanctioned. Could you talk about, this in so many ways, this is such a huge win and the scope of these sanctions. I mean, I really want us to kind of dive into just how massive and serious they are. They are truly unprecedented in terms of what we've seen, even in the last couple of years. Give us a quick overview of the impact, but then also, could these sanctions have been introduced sooner? We're hitting we're almost at the third year anniversary of this horrific onslaught.
So let me talk about both sides of this, and I have been part of the conversation about U.S. sanctions against the Russian energy sector going back to the spring of 2014. So we've been at this for a long time. You're right that last Friday represented a dramatic stepping up of those sanctions. I would highlight several big buckets and then a lot of extra ornaments. The most important strategic point is that unlike the earlier efforts, for instance, our work with the G7 to enforce a price cap on Russian crude oil, Friday's measures were specifically targeted at not just driving down Kremlin revenues, but also reducing the volume of crude oil that Russia can put onto global markets. The reason that was so important is because for more than 2 years since the launch of the price cap, our approach has always been conditioned by the idea that we had to be very careful not to take steps that would have the effect of shocking global markets and creating a situation where Putin would be able to get more revenue for less oil. Because remember, that's our objective, is drive down revenue. So this was the first time we specifically named 2 Russian oil majors, Surgit Naftogaz and Gazprom Neft. We also went after 183 shadow fleet vessels in order to raise the cost for Russia of that shadow fleet, and you can see that policy is working. I woke up this morning to a Bloomberg story about the dozens of tankers that are off the coast of China now because their customers in China don't want to take delivery because of the risk of sanctions that's now attached to those transactions. Third, we attacked the whole ecosystem that supports the Russian energy export industry. So going after insurance companies, going after oil field services companies, going after the facilitators of Russia's exports. And then the ornaments, we also continued our determined effort to kill Arctic LNG 2, the flagship LNG project of the Russian Federation. We identified for sanctions 2 Chinese ports that had previously been taking delivery of sanctioned Russian commodities. We sanctioned the CEO and the whole board of Rosatom. And critically, we went after a variety of Russian mining and metals companies in the lithium sector, in the coal sector. So this really was a comprehensive effort to drive down Russia's resources. As you say, pursued in very close cooperation with our G7 allies, simultaneous measures by the European Union, closely coordinated with Europe. I was discussing these issues in Paris, in London, and Tokyo last month. And you see we're determined to move forward together. We've also worked closely, I would flag, with India, which has become, because under the price cap mechanisms, one of the major destinations of Russian crude. And we were very careful to execute this policy in a way that made clear that our target was not our friends in Delhi, but it was the Russian Federation and driving down Russia's revenues. And frankly, I've been very encouraged to see big Indian oil majors, including Bharat Petroleum and Reliance and others, rushing away from Russian crude. So for all of us who have been seeking to raise the cost to Putin from his brutal and unprovoked invasion, Friday was a very big day, and more importantly, I think the way in which markets have reacted since then goes back to my point about how the international energy map has changed, because there is supply in the market which creates an alternative to Russia. Much is from the United States, some is from Canada, some is from Brazil, some is from Guyana, some is from untapped capacity in the Gulf, including UAE and Saudi. So Russia is on its back foot, and I think this is the other point I would make in the context of the debate we're having in Washington around the political transition. Putin is losing. There is nothing about Russia's victory that should be seen as inevitable. And you only need to look at the headlines out of Moscow, the internecine warfare over who to blame for all of this, the questions that are coming up around the Russian banking sector. Putin is paying an enormous price for his hubris and obsession with imagined history. And we are determined to impose a cost.
Let's go back to your comments on working with countries like India and others, because we're already having a lot of excellent questions. And I'm going to combine 2 or 3 here that are along the same lines in terms of how do we work on minimizing unintended consequences of sanctions? You started explaining that a little bit, but I'd love to hear a bit more on what that looks like, but also impacts on developing nations, nations that are really paying attention to the energy costs, competitiveness. That's not just a developing nations conversation. That's a huge issue for Europe and the United States as well. So could you give us some more examples of ways that we can mitigate the unintended consequences of the sanctions?
So let me make a couple of points. Let me start with Japan. Among other reasons, I had the opportunity today to catch up with my friend METI, Director General Kihara, who is in town. He was my gracious host, along with the MOFA Director General last month when we had the US-Japan Energy Security Dialogue. Japan is a particularly important case because it is the most energy insecure of the G7 countries. It's also a country that we have a vital treaty alliance relationship with. So making sure that we navigated these issues with our Japanese allies in a way that is sensitive to Japan's vulnerability, but also the prospect for US and Japan to do much more together, including the foundational role that Japanese companies and Japanese off-takers played in the US LNG industry. I was with Senator Sullivan this morning, who was reminding me of the role that the Cook Inlet LNG projects played in the dawn of the global LNG trade, and the importance of that long relationship, and the hope that we will see even more in the years ahead in terms of growing Japanese investment upstream in the United States and growing that LNG relationship. But I'll also say, and as you know, Olga, although I'm particularly passionate on everything that has to do with Ukraine and our support for the Ukrainian people, I have a global portfolio. So I traveled around the world over the past 2.5 years, and especially when I was in the developing world, in South America, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia. You get a real sense that especially developing countries feel whipsawed by what Putin has done to them. And I always remind them, I say, you're upset because fertilizer costs are spiking, fuel costs are spiking. There's one address that you need to write to solve that, and it's the Kremlin in Moscow, Russia. But I think this is why we have been so focused on trying to exercise our sanctions policy in a way that doesn't further disrupt a severely disrupted global energy market. I think the good news, as I alluded to earlier, is I think we're out of the woods on that. You can see that in terms of how calmly crude oil markets have responded to the sanctions package that we rolled out on Friday. You see it in the normalization of LNG prices globally, and prices go up and down, and there are people in the audience today who are in this business, and I'm glad I'm not, in terms of having to deal with the vagaries of the market. But at the end of the day, you look at the latest analysis, including from the IEA, the world is going to continue to enjoy deep markets significant supplies for traditional energy, oil and gas, and at the same time, we are growing the supplies of renewables. And it's a good thing because you see spiking demand both in the developed countries. Everybody in Washington, D.C. is now alive to what we see in Loudoun County and the spike in demand coming from artificial intelligence. But equally important, in places like India, sub-Saharan Africa, huge demand in power requirements for cooling because of climate change. And I was glad to hear that the Secretary of Energy nominee in his hearing today, which I did not watch, was asked about this. And of course, he's an energy executive, so he understands this. And he made the point, as I was told, that he pointed to his own suit. He said, there are a lot of parts in the world where people don't wake up every day and put a suit on, but that's the lifestyle they want. So they want air conditioners and refrigerators and vehicles and big screen color TVs. And all of those things take energy. So as I look out over the decades ahead, the world is going to need all the energy that we can find. We need to deliver that energy in the most sustainable way possible. And we have to deliver that energy in a way that ensures energy security. And that is, I think, the fundamental lesson of 2022, is that we cannot take energy security for granted. That's why my bureau was created, was to think about how we leverage America's energy abundance to advance our own energy security at home, but also to support our friends and allies around the world.
Thank you, Ambassador. As you rightfully mentioned, as we're having this event, the hearings are taking place, confirmation hearings are taking place. And we have a really excellent question from the audience. As the new leadership enters the scene on Monday, what advice would you have for them in balancing these pressures against even adversaries? For example, some of the major energy players such as Russia, Venezuela, Iran.
So I obviously can't speak for the incoming administration. My most important advice to them as regards the State Department is listen to the career professionals who want them to be successful, and I'm incredibly proud of the ENR team and what we've built in the past couple of years, and we can talk more about that later. I think thinking about energy as a strategic asset, and that's what Fred and I started our conversation on in Istanbul as well, that we need to remember that this is a resource. First of all, we don't need to worry about America's energy independence anymore because we're there. And sometimes that's not understood. And I think, again, remembering, compare the world of today to the world of the first Trump inauguration 8 years ago. US crude oil production up about 70% in that time. US LNG exports, essentially zero at that point, pretty close to zero. Today, we are the largest LNG exporter in the world. And by the end of the Trump administration, we will have doubled what we're doing today. So this is a level of energy abundance that is unprecedented in American history. And at the same time, we are leading the world on the energy transition. And we have to keep investing on that side of the equation as well for a world that is going to be looking for every kind of energy that it can find to deal with all the challenges that I pointed to. So I think, the fundamental message that I would convey in this context is we can't do it alone. Senator Rubio in his hearing today talked about how important it is for the State Department to think about the interests of the American people and America's national security. My first Secretary of State, I came to the State Department as an intern in 1984. George Shultz was Secretary of State, and he was famous for having a globe in his office. And he would have new outgoing ambassadors come and point to their countries. And if you're the poor guy who pointed to Guatemala, he would say, no, 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 your country is the United States. And that is the philosophy of the Foreign Service and the State Department that I've been brought up in. But I think what's different is that in that world of the 1980s, the United States was extraordinarily dependent on oil from the Middle East. We also didn't have to deal with China, China which was an inconsequential consumer of energy when I joined the Foreign Service, is today one of the major demand centers. It's also a country that has a 15 to 20-year head start on us in terms of dominating the energy industries of the future, hoovering up critical minerals around the world, seeking to monopolize, using overproduction to monopolize supply chains for batteries, for solar technology, for electric vehicles. So that's why the legacy of the Biden administration through the Inflation Reduction Act is so important, because it put us back into the game in those sectors as well. And I've always thought, in terms of my role, I have the good fortune of being Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources in a moment of unprecedented American energy abundance. But I also have a responsibility to make sure that we're positioned so that my successor 20 years from now, in a world that's going to see, by definition, a lot more renewables, a lot more nuclear, almost zero coal, probably less crude oil, still a lot of gas, that in that future energy scenario, that the United States remains the partner of choice around the world, and that we maintain the leadership that our companies have established.
This ties in really beautifully with a question that we have from Fred Hutchinson, who leads LNG Allies, and who kindly reminded us of remarks by Maros Shevkovich of the EU Commission, who said that America has become the principal guarantor of global energy security. Has there been realization on the U.S. side of kind of that role? Have we come to terms, to grips with this, or do you feel like...
I think Fred knows the answer to that question, which is yes. And I have a relationship with Vice President Šefčovič that goes back to my time as ambassador in Ukraine, when we first started working on what we then called reverse flow, which involved taking gas from Slovakia to supply it back into Ukraine after Putin tried to pull the energy weapon out on Yanukovych. So I think this is very well understood, certainly in the State Department. You only need to look at all of the effort that we have put into deepening our energy partnerships with allies around the world, the work with Japan, the work that I do with Korea, what we've done in the LNG task force, what we've done in the US-EU Energy Council. And a big part of that story, as Fred alluded to, is the extraordinary growth that we've seen in US LNG liquefaction capacity, the shale gas revolution, but also the ability of the United States uniquely to mobilize the capital that this industry requires. And I always joke with folks, one of the things I learned early on in this job, somebody would ask, well, what's a project going to cost? And I always found if you guessed $1 billion, you would be in the right ballpark, because this is a sector that just has extraordinary upfront costs. And that's why, as I said, if you can look at where we are today in terms of our LNG industry, and the projects that are only reaching FID now, it's going to be the end of the Trump administration, but before those put molecules onto the water. And so that's why this strategic reorientation that Fred and I talked about is so important, because we have to incorporate that aspect of the issue as well. And I have an entirely externally focused job. I have no responsibilities for the U.S. domestic energy industry, U.S. domestic energy policy. But I also understand that there are many, many American citizens who pay my salary, whose livelihood is linked to the energy sector. And I, as I said, I saw Senator Sullivan today. I think I'm the only Biden administration Assistant Secretary of State who traveled to Alaska. The great privilege of going to Alaska, talking to Governor Dunleavy and our companies and some of the tribal groups about their energy sector and the linkages that has to my work outside. I'm also very sure I've visited Houston more than any other State Department official over the past 4 years, and all the work that we've done with our energy companies. But I also, every time I go to Houston, I come back with another anecdote to take with me when I travel abroad, explaining to my foreign interlocutors that Texas also happens to be the #1 state in the United States on wind and solar, and is leading the way on clean hydrogen, on carbon sequestration, all of the new technologies that are part of the decarbonization of our energy system.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary. And I want to remind our in-person audience, I'm already getting a lot of really excellent questions on virtually, but I do want to remind people that there is a mic. If you wanted to ask something live in person, please go ahead and line up, and I'll be happy to call on you. But in the meantime, allow me to go back to the excellent list of questions that we have here virtually. I'm going to combine 2 or 3 of them. Speaking of strategic orientation, you mentioned several projects and what that orientation looks like on the ground in terms of building them out and the level of diplomacy that it takes. A couple of questions are, really focused on working with landlocked countries and how that's always the most, the reorientation, decoupling has always been most challenging for those countries. And a broader question in terms of, for some of them like Hungary and Slovakia that are still kind of seeking to maintain some of those relationships, some of those flows, is that a concern for Europe? If we look in the broader scope of things, a couple of BCM compared to 200 in the past or 137 in the past, in a broader scope of things, that doesn't seem like much. But if you're a country and your entire demand is 1, 2, 3, 4 BCM, then it's a different conversation. So is that still a concern, even if if it's just a couple of countries in Europe that are continuing that relationship, or is that threat to the broader European unity? And let me also combine another questions, just to make it even easier, in terms of just the role of Turkey in this equation. In so many ways, Turkey has been an incredible ally to Ukraine and support Ukraine in so many different ways. An incredible ally to Europe and has partnerships on multiple levels. When it comes to energy as well, but it also continues supporting Russian gas flows to Europe as well. So talk to us about how do we kind of move forward through these complex relationships with the landlocked countries, with Turkey.
So let me do those separately, but I'll try to be quick about it. So Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, basically is what you're talking about. Yes. There. I think this is ultimately a question for Brussels, and the decision has clearly been made in Brussels to get to 0 by 2027. I think it's very important that Commissioner Jorgensen has outlined a target of having a concrete plan for full de-Russification within 100 days, and the United States strongly supports that goal, as John Kirby signaled from the White House podium last week. I think. And it's important to remember, for instance, on Slovakia. Slovakia is energy secure. The government has reasserted that just in recent days. A lot of it's about making money, and who profits off of these arrangements. And I think Europe remembers, and I know that DG Energy understands, and this is back to my point about being in Athens, the extraordinary cost that Europeans paid, the pocketbook cost that Europeans paid for their dependence on Russia. It's a very expensively earned lesson about the value of energy diversification. So the price of a molecule of Russian gas is not just what comes on the invoice. It's the larger insecurity and the risks that come from that. And as we talked about earlier, Bulgaria lived through that. Turkey is a unique and special case, and I'm grateful to the Atlantic Council for giving me on 2 occasions excuses. Daphne's out there to go to Istanbul, and I was really impressed when we were together in Istanbul a month before last by the clarity that both Energy Minister Bayraktar and Deputy Foreign Minister Ekinci, both of whom are good friends and great colleagues, they both spoke very clearly about Turkey's own interest in diversification. We're seeing a reminder again of the vitally important crossroads role that Turkey plays because of the recent developments in Syria and the potential for Turkey to be a major part of answering the short-term energy crisis that Syrians are navigating in the aftermath of the Assad regime. And then finally, on an issue, I've spent a lot of time in this job working with the government of Turkey, the government of Iraq, including Prime Minister Soudani, Energy Minister Hayyan, and the rest of the Iraqi government to support the restoration of the ITP pipeline and the strategic goal of Iraq's energy independence by 2030 and ending the corrosive impact that Iranian energy has on Iraqi politics and society. So you see a pattern here where we're thinking about energy as a strategic asset, and then building the partnerships. Turkey has made very large investments in additional regas capacity. We welcome that. We welcome the role that Turkey has played as a channel for conveying some of that non-Russian gas to southeastern Europe. And I think Ankara also is not interested in being an energy dependency of Moscow.
Let's travel from Turkey to Georgia. We have an excellent question from Bob Eichward in terms of how are the developments in Georgia? Are they a threat to things like Southern Gas Corridor? And let me add my question on top of that. You know, the questions around the clarity of Azeri gas exports and how much of these exports are Russian gas versus Azeri gas. I would love to get your answer on both of those questions.
So there's a lot loaded there. I will first say that it is a source of great pride and confidence to me that the U.S. ambassador in Tbilisi is a former ENR PDAS and dear friend and colleague, Robin Dunnigan. There's nobody in the U.S. government better equipped to think strategically about these issues in the context of the huge political challenges that Georgia has to navigate. On the larger question of the Southern Gas Corridor and Azeri resources, I, of course, have also been to Azerbaijan on a number of occasions. I've met with President Aliyev. I was in Baku for COP29 and was happy especially to join Ambassador Libby and spend some time with Energy Minister Jabarov. He was crystal clear, first in terms of the importance of Shah Deniz as an asset for Europe and the Azeri interest in continuing to develop that asset, but also he could not have been more clear that Azerbaijan does not want to be a laundromat for Russian molecules. And he made very clear that on all of the ideas that were talked about a few months ago in terms of rerouting or relabeling molecules, that if this was not something that the US was on board with, that if this was not something that the Europeans were on board with, he wasn't going to spend any more time thinking about it because they see plenty of demand in the future coming from other destinations along the Southern Gas Corridor, which is why that 2-decade US investment in building that infrastructure was so important. And again, I would emphasize this is a project which I actively pursued as President Trump's ambassador in Greece, which my predecessors in the Obama administration, and you go to the terminal in Baku, and one of the things you see there is Amos Hochstein's signature autograph right there on the pipe as a reminder that this is a project which would not have happened without American diplomatic leadership. And I'm here at the Atlantic Council, American diplomatic leadership going back to Dick Morningstar, going back to David Goldwyn. This was a project that American energy diplomats worked to make happen over multiple administrations, over multiple decades. Equally the case, I am quite confident that the IGB pipeline wouldn't be working today if Hiro Mustafa, who was our ambassador in Sofia in those days, and I in Athens had not been as closely tied up as we were with the European Commission and with the governments concerned to bring it to fruition. Remember, that's a project that was completed during the pandemic, so you had all of the added complications that arose there. So this is why America's energy diplomacy matters so much in a world in which energy is increasingly recognized as a strategic asset, but also a world in which energy markets, energy supply chains, and energy production is completely globalized. We cannot do this alone.
Thank you for helping us appreciate the level of effort that goes into behind the scenes that a lot of times a lot of us are not exposed to, we are not aware of. And as you said, multiple administrations, multiple government officials kind of pushing towards these efforts. Let's switch over from oil and gas to nuclear and critical minerals. And of course, I'm glad that we spend the majority of this event on oil and gas because that's where Russia draws most of its revenues that it then takes and uses towards wars and aggression, particularly in Ukraine. But critical minerals and nuclear are strategically, I would argue, could be just as important.
Right.
Let's talk about also the relationship and the connection to China here. China being a massive player in the critical minerals space. and the relationship and the connection between Russia and China, and then the incoming administration's posturing towards and kind of anticipated relationship and trade talks with China on top of all of this, all kind of tied in together. So talk to us, how do we navigate this space where I would say like the next layer of decoupling is the nuclear supply chains, are the critical materials, and then you have these complex relations and other additional dependencies outside of Russia, like China, that we have to navigate together with Europe as well.
Right. So let me do those separate, because they're
Yes.
different problems with different solutions. Critical minerals, first of all, I was absolutely delighted to see this issue feature also in Senator Rubio's confirmation hearing. He is, of course, the co-author of the Warner-Rubio Critical Minerals Bill before the Senate, and my team in R has led with the State Department's and U.S. government's flagship initiative, working internationally to build diversification in critical mineral supply chains. The three unavoidable realities, first of all, we need massively increased volumes of these minerals to support our energy growth and decarbonization. Cobalt, lithium, nickel, zinc, copper, rare earths. We're going to need extraordinary growth in the volume of those materials, and it's not all going to come from the United States. Second, we are in a situation of unsustainable dependency on China, especially for the processing, but also significantly for the extraction of those minerals. So that's why we created the MSP, an initiative which today brings together 15 countries in the European Union, more than half of global GDP, but critically, we've created a layer of other structures. The MSP Forum, which involves the producer countries, everybody from Serbia to Argentina, who are looking to market their opportunities to non-Russian, non-Chinese alternatives. We've created an MSP finance network to crowd in resources from our government finance agencies, and it was another huge development towards the end of the Biden administration that didn't get the attention it deserves, was the Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative announced by the Export-Import Bank last week, which creates a vehicle for EXIM to invest in production overseas of critical minerals and inputs which go into U.S. manufacturing and U.S. competitiveness. We need to grow those resources. We need to continue doing what we're doing with the Development Finance Corporation. And again, remember, DFC was created under the first Trump administration. I've worked closely both with Adam Bollner in the previous administration and with Scott Nathan in this administration. Incredibly proud of the partnership between Scott and myself, and between ENR and DFC, so much so that one of my DASs, Anna Spitzberg, is now at DFC because the energy sector is so much in need of the kind of leaning in finance that DFC can facilitate. But we need to leverage the same from JOGMEC, from Canada, from Australia, from the EU. So that's the answer to the question on the critical minerals side. The MSP is now chaired by Korea. I know the Korean government is going to be looking for early signals of how the Trump administration is going to approach these questions. And based on Senator Rubio's answers today, I'm optimistic, but we'll have to wait and see. Nuclear, again, back to the Senate. I remember I was appearing before the committee, before Foreign Relations, I think last year. Senator Rish's, now Chairman Rish's, first question to me was about what we are doing on nuclear supply chain dependency. The United States still gets about 20% of our nuclear fuel from Russia. So it's going to take time to build out a non-Russian supply chain for those nuclear fuel materials. That's led by my friend and colleague Elliot Kang in the ISN Bureau. But it's also really important to my work that we maintain leadership also in areas like small modular reactors. And there's a lot of excitement here in the United States, but I was talking to Director General Kihara today about the work that GE Hitachi are doing. I'm also really excited to see what's happening. Marco is here from ENI, what's going to happen in the fusion sector and how this spike in demand that's happening in the United States for power for AI is mobilizing capital that wouldn't be there earlier. to help accelerate the pace of innovation in this nuclear space, which is still 20% of overall US power supply, and we need it to continue, if not expand at that level. But I'm also very excited that, and as somebody who spent 3 years at the IAEA in Vienna, talking about the nuclear renaissance 20 years ago, I'm very excited that it looks like we're actually starting to see that happen, not just in the big developed countries, but the prospect and the demand signal. I was in Singapore in the fall for the opening of the IEA's regional office. We have a new 123 agreement with the Philippines, with Singapore, huge demand signals from Southeast Asia to get into this area as well. Most of these countries wouldn't be able to start thinking about the quantum of expense that would come with a conventional 1,100 megawatt traditional reactor, but they see SMRs as a more manageable technology, and we should all be interested in American leadership there.
Thank you so much. The digital frontier seems to be just as important, especially in the last several decades, as hard security, as supply security, just as important as kinetic threats. And we're seeing increased cybersecurity attacks, disinformation campaigns. These are the new weapons of choice of countries like Russia. This is the new hybrid warfare that we're in. Could you talk us through about ways that we can support our allies, work with our allies? One example that comes to mind, just Baltics working towards decoupling from Russia's electricity grid, and just being bombarded with cybersecurity attacks, disinformation, these scare tactics that you are not going to be able to survive through this. Your electricity grid is going to collapse. How do we address this together? What are some effective mechanisms? Give me a minute and a half on this.
Yeah, so what's happened in recent weeks reminds me a little bit of when the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal, and all of a sudden we all learned a lot of things about global container traffic and how vulnerable our critical infrastructure was there. And on this, I have a personal sense of it because I was U.S. ambassador in Ukraine in 2015. When we saw the Fancy Bear attack on the Ukrainian Energy Ministry, the first instance in my knowledge of Russia using cyber weapons as a weapon of war, as part of their attack on Ukraine's sovereignty. This has now become standard operating procedure, and we're all putting a lot of effort into that. I'm incredibly admiring of my colleague Nate Fick and what he has done in building up State Department's Cyber and Digital Policy Bureau from zero to begin building the same kind of toolkit on the cyber side that ENR has built over the past decade on the energy side. But I think what your question alludes to also is the fact that I think increasingly, and Nate and I work together all the time, but I think increasingly these sectors are becoming intertwined. Digital is a huge driver for power supply, but also cyber and digital tools as both a enabler of energy efficiency and the rollout of new energy infrastructures, but also as a vulnerability that has to be addressed from a security standpoint. And that's where BREL is really important. And I talked earlier about January 1st, but I've also got a laser eye on February and the desynchronization of the 3 Baltic countries from the BREL network. I understand in Vilnius there's a big countdown clock now, marking the hours until the Baltic states are fully desynchronized, and that was a big focus of my travel through the region in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in April. And it was very clear to me at the time that the governments were absolutely determined to make this leap.
Lots of historic moments that we're living through. A final question, 30 seconds. I know that's a big one for the final one. But big picture reflection in terms of your time, your unprecedented, unmatched experience working for the U.S. government in a variety of roles, working for the Foreign Service. This allows you to reflect on this in a very unique way. How has the role of U.S. Foreign Service officials, from ambassadors to officers and other roles, transformed and changed over the years? Their relevance, their importance? And is there anything that next administration or just future leaders can do to empower our civil servants to optimize their skills just addressing these geopolitical issues that we're facing today.
So thanks for the question, Olga. And I would normally protect the confidence of my conversations with Senator Sullivan, but I would just note that we were talking about exactly this issue this morning. And I would just note a little bit on the ENR origin story. So my bureau, as I understand it, and it's some of Senator Lugar's staff who told me this story, so I think it's true, that it was actually Senator Lugar who was the first one to press the State Department, saying State Department needs a dedicated energy bureau to think about energy as a strategic resource. He did that when Hillary Clinton was going through her confirmation process, and thank goodness he did. I talked earlier about what Nate has done in CDP, because it's really hard to build new institutions, but ENR has played a vital role in the effectiveness of the State Department's and the United States response to both Putin's weaponization of energy and the invasion of Ukraine. But I would also note that one of the things that I don't think Senator Lugar anticipated at the time was that by 2025, when you say energy, we wouldn't just be talking about oil and gas. Mm-hmm. Increasingly, we're talking about those critical minerals. We're talking about supply chains. We're talking about battery technology. We're talking about electric vehicles. We're talking about hydrogen. So building a cohort of State Department diplomats who understand these issues, who can work on the ground, and I have spent the vast majority of my Foreign Service career overseas, and I'm always reminding my political masters that the work of the State Department is not done in Foggy Bottom. The work of the State Department is done in our embassies and consulates around the world. That's where the rubber meets the road. And I'm very proud of the work that we've done. We had, to give an example, just last month we launched, in conjunction with the DOE laboratories, a new critical minerals course in Chicago, much like the famous ENR energy course, which we've been running in Houston for several years, and incredibly strong uptake from officers around the world who recognize that this is going to be one of the arenas for strategic competition, and they're trying to figure out, how do I mobilize the US government toolkit to be effective in this domain as well?
Thank you so much. What a great place to finish our conversation, even though I feel like we could go for a few more hours. We couldn't cover everything. But I just really want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank our in-person audience. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I want to thank our virtual audience who's joined us online, and for the excellent questions that we've received that kept us an engaging conversation. And of course, Under Secretary Pyatt, Assistant Secretary Pyatt, it's just really an honor to have you here with us today. This conversation, for those who missed it or part of it, will be available online. You will be able to see it on our website, YouTube, and social media channels. And of course, to have this kind of event take place, it takes a lot of talented people to make this come to life. I want to recognize Haley, Denise, Nicole, Amy, Elena from our Global Energy Center and Europe Center, and of course, huge thanks to the leadership of our Senior Director, Lyndon Darrence. Really grateful for your leadership here, and just want to make sure that all of you follow our next events, particularly our January 30th conversation on the transatlantic competitiveness.
Right,
so,
you've got all of my European friends and colleagues coming.
I do, so I'm just really thrilled to continue discussion. So thank you, Assistant Secretary. Thank you all. Until next time.
Thank you. Thanks, Olga.